Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual training entitled Building Bridges, Enhancing Police Response to Targeted Violence and Community Collaboration. This virtual training is provided under a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, to the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development, the John W. McCormick Graduate School for Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And as we go through today's presentation, you'll see the importance of why we're calling it Building Bridges and Community Collaboration. I think we in law enforcement understand that in these type of targeted violence, hate crimes that are occurring, we have to work in partnership with the community to co-produce public safety. And we think about some recent events that have happened as we begin this training. The two the couple that worked at the Israel embassy there in Washington, D.C., that were recently gunned down there because of who they were. And then in Boulder, Colorado, where at a Jewish event to support the hostages in Gaza, an individual shouting "Free Palestine" through Molotov cocktails at some of those persons that were there. And then finally, in the state of Minnesota, where elected leaders were targeted for assassination by an individual. So there's not a better time for us to take a couple of hours and go through a presentation such as this. My name is Gerald Monahan. I'm a retired public safety official here in the state of Arizona. In fact, I'm coming to you from Arizona. It's 8 o'clock my time. I know 11:01 there in the state of Massachusetts. I've got over 4 decades of experience in public safety. I served as a detective, as a crime scene technician, as a patrol officer, a patrol sergeant, commander over criminal investigations, and a police chief in several municipalities and at my campus here at Yavapai College, which is located in Prescott, Arizona. I'm about 2 hours north of Phoenix, actually up in the high country. And so I enjoy the cooler weather up here. I serve also as the senior trainer for the nonprofit Police to Peace, who's in partnership with UMass Boston to create this training today. I'm currently the program director of the Administration of Justice Studies, a professor here at Yavapai College. I left policing about 4 years ago. I graduated from the FBI National Academy for law enforcement executives in the 230th session. And I hold a master's and a bachelor's degree in public safety administration and leadership. 2013, I served as the president of the Arizona Association of Chiefs of Police. So I tell you, it's my honor to have the opportunity to talk with all of you about this topic, about the importance of this topic in this time in our society. Now, the course purpose for today is to equip law enforcement officers with some strategies that will enhance their ability to address targeted violence in an effective manner. We want to integrate what's called the peace officer framework, where the emphasis is on empathy, fairness, and justice. We want to focus in a big way on the restoration of trust, the stabilization of communities that have been impacted, and then preventing further harm. And we'll spend some time on prevention efforts and prevention strategies later on in the presentation. And then we want to think of ourselves as law enforcement officers as guardians of safety and dignity, and not just enforcers of the law. Our learning objectives for this session: we want to define and differentiate targeted violence, hate crimes, and hate incidents. We want to identify the key bias indicators and offender profiles that exist to help us establish the motivation for the crime. We'll look at the historical and some cultural impact of hate crimes. And then in a lot of the material we'll talk about, we want to implement victim-centered investigative practices to strengthen community relations through proactive collaboration. Now, when we think about targeted violence, one of the things we should recognize is the impact is greater than just the individual that was targeted. And why is that? Well, the individual that was targeted represents characteristics that were targeted, and those characteristics exist within the larger community. So while one individual may have been targeted, the targeting was represent because of the characteristics of that individual. And individuals don't, you can't change those characteristics. So a targeted violence incident can affect the entire community and not just the individual victim. The motivation from the perpetrators are to instill fear, division, and instability within that community. And the role that law enforcement plays in the restoration of safety and trust is significant. We have to be seen as a co-producer of public safety with the communities we serve. And the graphic on the screen in front of you has the sign Stop Asian Hate. And think about when COVID-19 was rampant throughout the nation and actually globally. And there was some rhetoric at that time that referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, the China virus, the Asian virus. And at that time in our nation, we saw a spike in discriminatory activities and hate incidents and hate crimes targeting those of Asian descent and Asian Americans. So it's a firm example of a group being targeted specifically because of rhetoric we saw being spread around. Now, at this time, and part of our grant requirements through DOJ is I'm asking you to take a brief pre-test. And the goal of this is to gauge your current understanding. The questions you'll be answering and will assess your knowledge of hate crimes, bias indicators, and investigative best practices. So on the next screen is the QR code. And in the chat box, there'll be a link in case you would prefer to use a link or the QR code. But if you would please take, say, 3 minutes and take this pre-training evaluation, we would appreciate it and allow us to comply with our grant requirements. So we'll come back at 11:10, 8:10 my time. I will see you soon. Thank you for taking the time to complete that pretest. Much appreciated. Now, this next slide represents a special report on targeted violence victimization that was completed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And the whole report was from 2005 to 2019, which represented a 14-year time period. So some of the bullet points will narrow that down a little bit. This first bullet point looks at 2015 to 2019, a 4-year period. And what they found was nearly 2/3 or 62% of targeted violence crime victimizations were for simple assault. Now, that's significant because we're talking about an act of violence. Somebody was assaulted, somebody was violently attacked, and that represented 62% for that 4-year time period. Now, the next bullet point points out the motivation for that assault, and it represented a bias because of the victim's race, ethnicity, or national origin. That was the most common motivation for these non-fatal targeted violence incidents during that same 4-year time period. Now, most non-fatal targeted violence crimes were motivated by gender bias, involving a female victim, and this was a 9-year period that they looked at from 2010 to 2019. And it's interesting, in this bullet point, they included victims of domestic violence. And one of the things we understand about domestic violence is domestic violence primarily, statistically, is a gendered crime involving a male assailant and a female victim. And then finally, during that 4-year time period, they saw that more than half, or 56%, of non-fatal targeted violence incidents were committed by a stranger, someone the victim did not know. Now, the targeted violence victimizations, when they broke it down by type of crime and bias motivation for that 4-year time period, they identified these characteristics, and clearly race, ethnicity, or national origin was the motivation behind the vast majority of these crimes in that 4-year time period, representing almost 60%, or well over 500,000 people. The next characteristic involved gender. Just a little over 250,000 individuals at 24.2%. Association, just under 250,000 people at 22.5%. And we'll talk more about association, because an association victim may not actually belong to the group that's being targeted, but because of a connection to that group, they're like a business partner, a marriage, they're targeted. Sexual orientation represented 20.3% of crime bias motivations for that 4-year time period. Again, a little over, or a little under quarter million people. Disability, individuals that were targeted because of their disability, 11% at a little bit over 100,000 victims. Religion, just over 100,000 victims at 9.4%. And then perception. Almost 75,000 individuals were victimized because of a perceived motivation belonging to the characteristics of the group being targeted. It's almost 75,000 victims. And we'll talk more about perception here in just a bit. Now, there's another survey and some information from a survey that I don't have a slide for, but it's the National Crime Victim Survey. And this is sent out nationally to collect data through an anonymous means from individuals who may have been victimized. For that 4-year time period, 2015 to 2019, they learned that about a quarter, 25% of individuals victimized by targeted violence did not report their victimization to the police. And what was stunning in this study was the reason why they didn't report. And what those two reasons were was, one, they believed the police could not do anything about it. And secondly, they believed the police would not do anything about it. Now, we all know that that may well be a perception, but as we're going to talk about further, perception is their reality. And for them, they perceived that about the police, and it was what they truly believed. Now, let's take the time to go through a couple of case studies of incidents that have happened in communities around the country. Um, any community could experience an incident that propels it into the national spotlight in a negative way. So we can learn from incidents in the past and how did they handle it before, during, and after, and what can we learn from it to be prepared in our own communities. So we're talking communities, large, small, medium, it doesn't matter. Any community could find themselves in the national spotlight with a targeted violence hate crime incident. This first case study comes to us from Oak Creek, Wisconsin in August of 2012, and it involved a mass shooting at the Sikh temple. 6 individuals were shot and killed, and 4 others were wounded by a 40-year-old self-proclaimed white supremacist. The individual committed suicide after he was shot by responding officers. And it's interesting to note that a lieutenant was one of the first responding officers and was actually shot 15 times, but survived. Now, what came out of this was a community meeting with the Sikh leaders in the community, and they began to discuss the outcomes and the commitments that would collaborate a working relationship moving into the future. And they came up with 9 guiding principles that they would operate under. And it's interesting, these principles, this story was actually printed in the Police Chief magazine in October of 2013. But the 9 guiding principles they came up with following this mass shooting were, number 1, to prioritize education and training for officers, including education and training about working with diverse communities. 2, to be proactive about reaching out to and establishing positive working relationships with the different cultural groups in the community. 3, to maintain a strong, visible leadership role in the aftermath of a hate crime or any public safety crisis. 4, be transparent and share as much information about an incident as the department can without jeopardizing an investigation. And we in law enforcement understand that there may be pieces of information that we simply can't release, things that would hinder our ability to get information from a suspect to help pinpoint their involvement. And so we do have some concerns there. The 5th guiding principle was to maintain a strong relationship with the media. And it's interesting, they mentioned that no comment does not get you anywhere with the media. 6, be approachable. Agree to meet with anyone in the community. 7, establish a standard of meaningful community engagement that encourages residents to bring in new ideas. In other words, be open to the suggestions and the thoughts from the community. 8, thoroughly investigate and accurately report every incident that might be a hate crime. 9, recognize that the police department is a community in itself and prioritize officer wellness. Officer wellness is important to not only officers and their families, but to the community at large. Ensuring that the officers are well mentally, emotionally, and physically allows them to serve with respect for the diverse communities they serve, and that is essential to public safety. Now, this next case study we'll look at comes to us from Charlottesville, Virginia. This also took place in August, but in the year 2017. I'm not sure what's going on in August, but both of these case studies were in the month of August. So anyway, this was a Unite the Right rally, which was actually a white supremacist rally that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the rally turned violent after protesters clashed with counter-protesters. More than 30 individuals were injured in that clash, in that confrontation. On the second day of the rally, August 12th, the Virginia State Police declared the rally to be an unlawful assembly, and a self-identified white supremacist deliberately rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters almost a half mile from the actual rally site. 1 female victim was killed, 35 others were injured. The driver of the car later pled guilty to 29 federal hate crimes in order to avoid the death penalty. It was a plea agreement. Now, Charlottesville, in order to respond to a community that had become frightened, angered, and frustrated by the violence that took place during that time, they brought in an independent consultant to do a report to evaluate the city's advanced planning and responses. And some of the things they came up with in this report are as follows. The demonstrations caught Charlottesville Police Department by surprise because permits were not required and events were not announced to the public. Social media monitoring and increased research about these groups and their regional members could have improved intelligence gathering. Operational plans for the Klan demonstration and the Unite the Right rally would have been more effective if law enforcement had sought out and integrated advice from jurisdictions that had experienced similar events. For example, the need to implement strict separation between the opposing groups. And again, these case studies point out the fact that we can learn from each other. We can learn from previous events and what they did right, what they could have done better. This report also said that the officers did not receive sufficient information or training to be prepared. Department-wide training, all hands meetings, and day of briefings cannot be replaced by simple roll call updates or email communication. De-escalation techniques and expectations of the rally should have been more effectively communicated to responding officers. Participating agencies must work in coordination and operate within a unified command. Critical points include awareness of operations plans, integrated on-site communications, as well as joint trainings. Poor planning led to several unlawful assembly declarations, which then required aggressive actions by law enforcement to enforce, including the use of tear gas. The preoccupation with preparations for the Unite the Right rally, city leaders did not sufficiently respond to criticism or questions from the public or explain the tactical decisions after the chaotic Klan rally. It left residents and business owners feeling extremely frustrated and distrustful. And local law enforcement underestimated the potential for violence and was unprepared for violent clashes. All agency personnel should be prepared to respond immediately to violence of any kind without unduly jeopardizing public safety. These are two great examples of how quickly an incident can happen and get out of hand if advanced preparations are not made. Now let's take a look at the definitions we're working under. These definitions come to us from the publications of the Department of Justice, from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, from the Anti-Defamation League, as well as other sources. And at the end of today's training, there'll be an opportunity for you to download the handouts and the material associated with today's training. Again, that'll be at the end of the training. So hate crime is defined as a crime in which the defendant intentionally selects a victim, or in the case of a property crime, the property that is the object of the crime, in whole or in part because of the actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, disability, or sexual orientation of any person. A hate incident, different from a hate crime because a hate incident does not rise to the level of a crime, are actions by an individual or group that, while motivated by hate or improper bias, they do not rise to the level of a criminal offense. Now, this may involve bias or prejudice comments, imaging, or other messaging to another individual that's based on race, religion, national origin, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. A hate group is defined as an organization whose ideology, goals, or activities are primarily or substantially based on a shared antipathy. Antipathy is that deep-seated feeling of dislike towards others, or a hostility or hatred towards certain people based on their personal characteristics such as race, color, religion, ethnicity, nationality, national origin, gender, and or sexual identity. And then finally, the definition of bias is a preformed opinion or attitude towards a group of persons based on their race, color, religion, national origin, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity or expression. Now, getting back to the NCVS survey, the National Crime Victim Survey, they began collecting data on hate crimes from 2013. And they have three criteria that they found necessary before they would classify something as a hate crime. Number one, did the offender use hate language? And we'll talk about what that is as we move forward, but that was their first criteria. Did the offender use hate language? Number two, did the offender leave hate signs or symbols at the scene of the crime? And then number three, and for me, this is what I see as most important, did the police confirm it was a hate crime? And why I say this is the most important in my mind is because the police are the one on the scene collecting the evidence, in doing the comprehensive investigation, following the leads, looking at all the bias motivation indicators before they would call it a hate crime. So again, those are the three criteria used in the National Crime Victim Survey. And the third criteria there, in my mind, is the most important, which points to the police as having a significant responsibility in doing a proper investigation, of doing a comprehensive investigation into reported hate crimes. Now I'd like to take a look at the legal framework for targeted violence crimes. Now these are all federal statutes, and we'll talk specifically about Massachusetts here in just a moment. But in looking at these 5 federal crimes here, this first one is the violent interference with federally protected rights. This statute makes it a crime to use or threaten to use force to willfully interfere with a person's participation in a federally protected activity because of race, color, religion, or national origin. Federally protected activities include public education, employment, jury service, travel, or the enjoyment of public accommodations. Under this statute, it is also a crime to use or threaten to use force against those who are assisting or supporting others in participating in these federally protected. You know, it's interesting in that statute that they mentioned travel. From the mid 1930s all the way into the mid 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, there was a book called the Green Book. The Green Book is a publication by African Americans for African Americans in the pursuit of travel. This book identified hotels, motels, restaurants, gas stations, and other areas of service for African Americans who were traveling. And it was a significant amount of information and work to put this together, but there were places within our country, especially in the South, that would not serve Black Americans, African Americans. And so this book was a useful tool at the time. Again, it's called the Green Book, and there's actually a movie about this now called the Green Book. Now, the next statute we'll look at is the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And this statute directed the Department of Justice to speed up the review of hate crimes for the purpose of bringing federal charges. The department was also to work on improving the reporting of hate crimes and hate incidents in light of the rise in anti-Asian hate during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in order to meet that goal, the law required the department to cooperate and work with local law enforcement agencies and to provide them with tools and resources that would assist in the reporting, the enforcement, and the prevention of hate crimes. The third statute we're looking at is the Damage to Religious Property, or the Church Arson Prevention Act. This statute prohibits the intentional defacement, damage, or destruction of religious real property because of the religious nature of the property, where the crime affects interstate or foreign commerce, or because of the race, color, ethnic characteristics of the people associated with the property. The statute also criminalizes the intentional obstruction by force or threat of force of any person in the enjoyment of that person's free exercise of religious beliefs. The next statute we look at is the criminal interference with right to fair housing. This statute makes it a crime to use or threaten to use force to interfere with housing rights because of the victim's race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin. And then finally, let's look at the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. This statute is named after Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., both who were murdered in a horrific manner over their characteristics. Matthew Shepard was an openly gay male in Wyoming who was beaten by two individuals, pistol whipped, and then tied to a fence post in rural Wyoming and left to die. He was found 18 hours later, taken to the hospital where he succumbed to his wounds and the exposure. James Byrd Jr. is an African-American man living in Jasper, Texas. Jasper, a community of about 6,000, 7,000 people, northeast of Houston and very close to the Louisiana state line. James Byrd is believed to have accepted a ride from an individual he knew, but there were three individuals who in that truck that he took a ride with, all associated with the Aryan Brotherhood from prison or the white supremacy movement. James Byrd Jr. was taken to an isolated area where he was beaten. He was then chained to the back of the pickup they were in by his ankles, and he was drugged for over 3 miles and died from that experience, from that assault. The Shepard-Byrd Act is the first statute allowing for federal criminal prosecution of hate crimes motivated by the victim's actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. The act makes it a federal crime to willfully cause bodily injury or attempt to do so using a dangerous weapon because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin. Now, in looking at hate crime legislation in the state of Massachusetts, and state by state is different. Not all states look at all 7 of these categories in what they consider to be a state hate crime. But in Massachusetts, you are looking at the following as hate crimes or hate incidents based on race or color, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, gender or sex, gender identity, or disability. And these are all areas that your state looks at when they consider whether something is a hate crime, a targeted violence, hate crime, or a hate incident. Excuse me. And let's take a look at some historical context and some examples of the historical context of targeted violence and hate crimes. In between the 19th and early 20th century, there was enforced racial segregation. Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow being a term of contempt or disapproval for those African Americans. It was a term meant to disparage, to belittle. The last of these Jim Crow laws were generally overturned in 1965, obviously because of the civil rights movement that was taking place across America, and especially in the South. These laws affected almost every aspect of daily life, mandating segregation of schools, parks, libraries, drinking fountains, restrooms, buses, trains, and restaurants. White only and colored signs were constant reminders of the enforced racial order. Now, the second historical event we'll talk about is the Japanese American internment camps during World War II. The United States forcibly relocated and incarcerated about 120,000 people of Japanese descent. They were placed in 10 different concentration camps operated by the War Relocation Authority, mostly in the western interior of the country. What's of interest in a big way is that 2/3 of these individuals, or almost 80,000 individuals, were American citizens. Even following the end of World War II, Japanese Americans faced significant discrimination. Many lost businesses that they had built up and owned, and many professionals were denied their licensing practices because of the targeted and hate incidents and hate crimes directed towards these individuals. And finally, the third one we'll look at from a historical context involved the Stonewall riots and the LGBTQ plus movement. Stonewall riots were a series of violent confrontations that began in the early hours of June 28, 1969. This was between the police in New York City and gay rights activists outside the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in the Greenwich Village section of New York City. It's believed that the spark that actually caused the riot was a openly lesbian individual was arrested, handcuffed, and then while handcuffed was hit in the head, struck by a New York City police officer. As the riots progressed, it's believed an international gay rights movement was born. Stonewall soon became a symbol of resistance to social and political discrimination that would inspire solidarity among homosexual groups for decades. Now, they mention in the material we looked at that it cannot be said that the gay rights movement was initiated at Stonewall, but is certainly recognized that it was a catalyst for the modern day gay civil rights movement. Now, in thinking about cultural contexts of targeted violence and incidents, we have to recognize that cultural targeting represents and may reflect deep-seated bias and historical discrimination. And addressing these crimes can require cultural awareness and significant police engagement in that community. Examples of cultural conflict could lead to hate incidents or hate crimes, and it includes the items listed on the graphic in front of you. Here we see a whole list of different behaviors, activities, of norms that belong to specific cultures. Things like customs, unique behaviors, the way they practice religion, unique language, the various rituals that the culture may engage in, and even how that culture is represented in their art and in their music. It's interesting. I attended some training in Minneapolis, Minnesota years ago on developing a community assessment tool in response to domestic violence. And there were Minneapolis police officers in this training. And one of the things they told us was in the Somali community, and apparently in Minneapolis, that houses the largest population of Somali immigrants in our nation today, is living right there in Minneapolis. But they mentioned that if they get a call for service of domestic violence in that community, in the Somali neighborhood, that a cultural norm was to talk to the recognized elder before they talked to the DV victim, the domestic violence victim. Now, coming from Arizona, I was shocked and just like, wow, that is interesting. But what they explained was if they didn't abide by that cultural norm for that community, it would be the victim of domestic violence who would pay the price for that. They would be the ones to be shamed, embarrassed, possibly even isolated or shunned because the police did not follow a recognized cultural norm within that community. It speaks to the importance of if they're able to hire Somali American police officers, or at least to specifically understand the reasoning behind those cultural norms. We have to recognize in our nation today, we are clearly a multicultural nation. And especially within our larger cities, like right there in Massachusetts, in Boston. Boston is a diverse city. It represents a lot of different cultures and backgrounds of the people that live there. We in policing have to be willing to be culturally aware in the work that we do. Now let's take a look at some of the bias indicators that are going to help us understand the motivation for a hate incident or a hate crime. We're talking about things like symbols, graffiti, swastikas, nooses, hate slogans, the various verbal slurs and threatening language used by the perpetrator at the time of the incident or the crime. And then, in a big way, the perpetrator's social media activity and affiliations. As a young officer, we didn't have social media. But when I think about its value today in understanding a person's mindset and their motivation for why they would do what they do, the activities that they post, the groups that they follow or belong to, and the affiliations on social media really can point to the reason for a motivated hate crime or hate incident. We also understand that people can become radicalized. They can be drawn into these groups by following certain social media activity and groups, and they become influenced by these. And on the graphic in front of you are a series of symbols, and these are commonly associated with white supremacy groups, Aryan Brotherhood, and so on and so forth, the Ku Klux Klan, Nazi movement. Continuing on and talking about bias indicators, where, have there been previous hate incidents in the area? And when I think about the value of a patrol officer who understands the beat they patrol, they would be probably one of the best sources of information as beat officers communicate with the community members and or they see the graffiti as they're patrolling, they begin to see graffiti pop up in certain areas. A patrol officer that's active in their beat area can be significant in understanding what's happening and recognizing hate incidents. And why is that important? Because we know that if there's not an intervention in a hate incident, then the frequency and the severity of these can morph into a hate crime very easily if there's not an intervention. Thinking about the timing of the incidents occurring, especially on significant dates. We have in January of this year was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yesterday was Juneteenth, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and the slaves were freed nationally by that proclamation. That could be a significant date that could also result in targeted violence. And I'm going to put something in the chat box here. It's called, and I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Shavuot. Shavuot is a Jewish activity, a Jewish holiday. And it's interesting that this actually began, it's a 2-day event, but it started on the same day as the Boulder, Colorado hate crime, where the individual shouted "Free Palestine" and threw Molotov cocktails at Jewish members of the community. But this activity that I just put in the chat box represented when the dates when the Ten Commandments were brought down from Mount Sinai. So for the Jewish people, it's a significant event, and it could be an area of targeting. We also, again, want to mention and emphasize the perpetrator's social media activity. And then other bias indicators could be the location itself. Was the targeted location a religious institution, or an LGBTQ center of support for members of that community? These could certainly all be representative of why they were targeted. Now, in thinking about that, we talked about perception, and a perception creates a challenge for us in targeted violence crime reporting. A victim may fear retaliation or lack of confidence in the police because of the way maybe the reporting comes out. We may be looking at a crime that is actually just a random attack. In other words, the bias motivation is not identifiable. We can't show a bias motivation for the reason for the attack. And so it's not classified as a hate crime or a hate incident. And then victims may feel that it is, and they perceive a lack of trust or confidence in the police. But that's why it's so important that we collect evidence, that we do a comprehensive investigation, because if it's a hate crime, again, we talked about the impact on a greater community who share the characteristics of the victim attacked. But if it's just a random attack and we can show the community that it wasn't targeted violence, that can help that community remain at ease. And then an individual's worldview may cause them to perceive something that may not exist. Has there been prior victimization? Have they been influenced by prior experiences where they have that victim label on their shoulder, and everything that happens to them, they perceive it's because of that characteristic? It's important that we in law enforcement get it right, that we do good police work, and that we classify things correctly. You know, it's interesting that, again, we talked about how perception is an individual's reality. And I think about tattoos and how easily a tattoo can be misinterpreted. It's interesting that how popular tattoos are today in our society. Even within law enforcement, we see police officers today wearing full sleeve tattoos. Depending on the individual looking at the tattoo, it can be misinterpreted as a hate symbol or a hate crime. It's interesting, when I worked for the Pinell County Sheriff's Office in Arizona, we had a deputy that put a full skull tattoo on the top of one of his hands. And how we found out about that was a victim of a violent crime called and said, "Don't ever send that deputy to my house again." The victim was offended and impacted by what they saw on the deputy's hand. Now, I come from an Irish American background, Irish heritage, and certain symbols within the Celtic community, Celtic being a part of Scottish Irish descent, and some of the symbols within the Celtic heritage could be misinterpreted for white supremacy and Aryan Brotherhood symbols. Now, again, thinking about crime versus incident and the importance of the proper classification, law enforcement must differentiate between bias-motivated crimes and otherwise general crimes or random acts. The elements of a hate crime will include, in a big way, the motivation for the crime, motivation for the act. So we have to consider that the motivating factors involve all of those classifications and characteristics we talk about: race, color, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, religion, disability, all the things we talked about in the definition of hate crime. We're looking for, how does we connect a motivation with those characteristics? So we're asking the question, was the individual or the property targeted due to being associated or part of a protected class? And then again, that was the location targeted due to the association with a protected class. Getting it right on this end is going to be significant for how the crime has impacted that community and what the community expects from us in law enforcement. Now let's begin to talk about some best practices in targeted violence investigations. And at the end of this slide, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back right at the top of the hour. But in best practices in targeted violence investigations, think about the preparation that goes into how we in law enforcement begin to prepare to deal with hate incidents, hate groups, so on and so forth. So investigators should make every effort to become familiar with the organized hate groups that are operating or influencing hate activities in the community. And again, let's get back to the beat officer. Beat officers may be in the absolute best position to begin to recognize signs and symbols and activities that are occurring within the areas of their assigned patrol. Beat officers should become familiar with the community leaders there, even formal or informal leaders in the community, and spend time talking with them. They may well hear things from those informal or formal leaders that are happening that can indicate a hate group is operating in that area. Ensuring that reporting forms include a readily available means to indicate whether there is preliminary information or evidence to suggest that the event may be a hate crime or incident. One of the things about hate incidents, because they don't rise to the level of a crime, we may not be capturing hate incidents in a well-documented way. So I think it's important for us as a police agency, a law enforcement agency, to treat hate incidents with the seriousness that is there because of the potential for them to become more frequent and more severe and morph into a hate crime. So I think full reporting and investigating of hate incidents is as important as a hate crime without the criminal elements. And then thirdly, identify individuals or agencies that may provide support and assistance to victims ahead of time. Have this list of resources available for immediate use. And these could include things like clergy, community service agencies that provide assistance to victims, such as shelter, food, clothing, childcare, or other related services. We don't know all the needs that a victim of a hate crime may have, but having this list of available services could be helpful when the needs that a victim has is identified. And we in policing, we're not foreign to working in multidisciplinary coalitions. You think about the number of CCRT, community coordinated response teams, that involve law enforcement working alongside of our social services partners, as sexual assault response teams, as SART. Again, we work with and are involved in coordination with collaboration and coalitions. And again, as we've talked about, the police should be the most knowledgeable about local resources in their community, because we are that 24/7 911 center where we respond to everything initially. And having a knowledge about local resources could be significant. Okay, let's go ahead and take about a 10-minute break, give you a chance to take a quick break and take care of things if you need to. I'm showing 8:52, 12:52 there in Massachusetts. So let's come back at 12, see, 8, no, no, I'm sorry, 11:52 there. So let's come back at 12:03 Massachusetts time, and I will look forward to seeing you in 10 minutes. Okay, we'll get started here in just a moment. This next hour, we want to begin to look at the various activities associated with a police response and a police investigation. So, as I mentioned, we'll start right at the 12:03. So that's coming up here in just a bit. Hopefully, everybody had a chance to take a break and take care of things they may need to take care of. Um, all right, so the initial response procedures, we're looking at things that involve the safety and well-being of victims. We talk about how this would be victim-centered. And so because of the impact on victims and the characteristics that they have that they cannot change, they're targeted because of characteristics they possess, as identifying them as a unique individual, but their association with the larger community. So the safety and well-being of victims is paramount, but at the same time, we understand the need for security and preservation of the crime scene, because we have to show, and within that crime scene is going to be evidence that helps us show the motivation behind the incident or the crime. So again, those two priorities are significant in that initial response. We want to ensure the victim is safe. We want to ensure the victim has access to support services, but then collecting the evidence that may indicate the commission of a hate crime is also paramount. Keeping our supervisors aware of actions that have been taken so far, making sure that the supervisor is notified. And then what statements are heard by the suspects? We know in the Boulder, Colorado incident, the individual, while throwing Molotov cocktails at victims, was shouting "Free Palestine," um, documenting what people have heard and getting, because those statements help us to identify the motivation for the activity. So the supervisor then has responsibilities to do the following: keeping the chief or the sheriff aware of what is occurring, notifying them. And one of the reasons that's important is because how quickly these incidents can get information about these crimes can get out into the community, because community members themselves can begin to share in real time on social media what is happening. And so a national narrative about what is happening in that community can go out within minutes or even real time of the event. And so there's going to be an expectation that the police chief or the sheriff or other city leaders will very quickly begin to put out information and hold a press conference. Providing updated information on the status of the investigation and the community impact within 48 hours. Now, we know in law enforcement that that information and updated information must come out quicker than 48 hours. But one of the reasons we talk about 48 hours is because the need for accurate information, the need for factual information may take time. So I think planning for an initial briefing from the police or a press conference could take place much sooner than 48 hours. I think follow-up information on the status of the investigation, that may take a little more time. And I think the police chief or the sheriff could say that we don't have all the facts yet, that this is under investigation, but we want to assure the community that we're on it and that the investigation is ongoing. Ensuring the victim has been connected with the appropriate support services. We talked about the need to understand those resources ahead of time and then very quickly connect that victim with those resources. Communicating with concerned community-based leaders. And I apologize, this line is not complete in the slide here, but we're talking about community-based leaders and community-based informal leaders and communicating with them. And then we have to make that determination. Is this incident to be classified as a hate crime or a hate incident? And this again is for proper reporting purposes. If it's a hate incident, then it falls short of the criminal elements we need to pursue a suspect. But the reporting is still very important. And we want to head off the potential for a hate incident to increase in frequency and in severity to prevent a hate crime for the future. Some responsibilities that we look at for the investigators involved. They're going to be the ones maybe to make that determination. Do the elements of a crime exist? And if they do, now we begin to look and identify the suspects in the crime. Recognize the need for additional investigative resources. Pull in the prosecutor's office. Make sure that if we've reached that this is a hate crime, we want to get input from the prosecutor's office about their needs. You think about the standards that we in police have. We have to reach probable cause to make an arrest. A prosecutor's office has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law to secure a conviction. That is a higher standard. It's a different standard than we in law enforcement have to reach probable cause. So we should pull the prosecutor's office in early, hear from them about maybe some ideas or needs that they have, and work to meet those needs. We should coordinate the investigation with other units of the agency. And then what other local and regional intelligence organizations exist that could help us understand who we're dealing with? What is the group association? What intelligence exists about the suspect or the hate group that we're dealing with? Make that determination based on evidence and facts as to the classification. Is it a hate crime or a hate incident? And then what other additional resources can we pull in from local, state, or federal agencies that may exist that make it necessary and available. And then taking those steps to ensure appropriate assistance is being provided to hate crime or hate incident victims. Now, in thinking about the interview and the interrogation strategies that we're going to use with targeted violence crime suspects, we recommend using open-ended questions to identify that bias motivation. And how does that come about? Well, in a big way, it's going to come about because we're going to let them talk. When we're doing that interview and interrogation with with the suspects in these targeted violence incidents, we want to let them talk. Let them explain the why and describe what they did and why they did it, and then ask the follow-up questions after they've made their statement. I think sometimes in law enforcement we're too quick to interrupt the flow of a statement because we want clarification about something they just said. Hold that till the end. Let them talk, and then do your follow-up questions for clarification and exploration after they've made their statement. Look for hate symbols, tattoos, and document the extremist beliefs that the suspects may have. Use an empathetic-based approach where the suspect may think you sympathize with their actions. In other words, don't show judgment, don't show contempt while they're making their statement. Let them believe that we sympathize with their. They may be more forthcoming. They may reveal the motivation because of that belief. If they're in custody, we're required to advise of their rights, their right to remain silent, and the right to assistance of an attorney. Now, it's interesting, keep this in mind. If they invoke the right to remain silent, we do get the ability to come back after a brief pause and ask them if they're ready to talk now. But if they invoke their right to the assistance of an attorney, we can't come back to start that interview until an attorney has been provided. So advising them of their rights is important in the procedural justice that all of us enjoy here in our nation. If it's appropriate, based on the given situation, consider interviewing the suspect in a neutral place where they're not in custody and they would believe they're not in custody. If they're not in custody and the suspect believes they're not in custody, then you do not have to advise them of their rights. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a neutral place. Even if the suspect is not in custody, but if there's multiple officers and police officials around, that could signal to them that they are not free to leave. And then we have a custodial interview involved. So maybe interviewing the suspect in their home or in a location where they would believe they're not in custody, and interviewing them by one detective or one officer. Again, the backseat of a police car, even if they're not in custody, if they're in the backseat of a police car, they're going to believe that they're in custody, and then advising them of their rights is required. Now, we have to come to understand the goals of targeted violence perpetrators. And we understand some of that to be to spread fear and division within a community that represents the classifications that we've talked about in the definitions. And then the goal to reinforce prejudice or to intimidate members of the targeted group. We see on the graphic in front of us here the burning crosses that many African Americans experienced in the front yards of their homes in the South. Clearly, an intimidation tactic used by members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups. And then the phrase "from the river to the sea," and the significance that that phrase means to members of the Jewish community. In other words, that statement is viewed as a form of annihilation for the state of Israel. So let's talk some specifics about victim-centered approaches to targeted violence crimes. And the very first bullet point here says to remain calm objective, and professional. Now, we in law enforcement certainly understand that, but think about this. The responding officials may also share the characteristics of the individual that was targeted. And so not allowing that association with the victim through those characteristics, we have to remain calm, objective, and professional, even though we ourselves may feel connected to the targeted group. Ask the victims how they want us to help them. Don't assume that we know what victims need. Let's let them tell us. And then if we need a translator, we should get the assistance of a translator when that becomes necessary. Understanding the communication that is being spoken is important. We may have to let the victim to defer answering questions or being involved in that comprehensive interview if their experience is true traumatic at the time. And we've learned this with officers involved in an officer-involved shooting, to allow those officers to have rest periods before completing a comprehensive interview. And that allows for our bodies to reset from the trauma. So if the victim is too distraught, we may have to reschedule that interview following a rest period or a time when the victim feels that they can complete the interview. Now, there is specific information we need immediately, but those, if the victim is suffering from trauma at the time, then just get that basic information and then reschedule the comprehensive interview for a later time. Asking the victim their thoughts on why this happened to them. Reassuring the victim that they're not to blame for what happened. Voicing our support for the actions the victim took to protect themselves and to possibly defuse the situation. We may have to allow victims to vent their feelings about the incident or the crime. And victims, they may also have had negative experiences with police response in the past, and that may come out in that venting. Encouraging victims to tell their story in their own words, and to the best of their ability, what was the exact words that the victim heard from the perpetrator or the suspect? What family members or friends can come to support the victim? And then keeping them informed of efforts that will be made to enhance their safety, and also keeping them informed about the sequence of events in the investigation, making sure victims understand what is happening within the investigation, providing information about community and department resources that is available to protect and support victims, their families, and members of the community may also be useful and needed. Now, we mentioned earlier the peace officer approach, the peace officer framework to targeted violent crimes. And the idea here is to recognize in the peace officer framework, this is the realization of the true purpose of policing. The police must be guardians of safety, not just enforcers of the law. And trust building is key in hate crime and hate incident investigations. We want the community to report. Collaborative partnerships with the community in the co-production of public safety is key in understanding what is happening from the community and receiving cooperation from the community. Advocacy and awareness are important, where the community trusts us to be the voice of the community in the investigation and awareness of the impact on that community. And we get that through in community engagement, where we're actively communicating with the community on a regular basis. And this could well lead to tips that allow us to prevent a hate crime or hate incident from happening. And then the peace officer framework is about effective, empathetic, and just policing. And we think about how important that is, that approach to community relations and possible crime prevention. It allows us to assess the impact of hate crime or hate incidents, and it continues the providing of assistance to the victim and the community at large. Working with the community after such crime or incidents can help reduce fears, stem possible retaliation, and provide additional hate crime, prevent additional hate crimes or hate incidents. We should be ready and willing to meet with community groups, neighborhood groups, and residents that are in those targeted communities and with other identified groups as a way to provide accurate, factual information about the investigation, but to hear from them about their fears and concerns. Engaging the media as soon as possible as partners in restoring the victimized group with their stability. And one of the interesting things about the media right now, you think about the national 24/7 media cycle that exists and the need for the media to get information out as quickly as possible, even before all the facts are known. But working with the local media may have a greater value. And so having those media liaisons, um, not only with the community-based organizations, but having a liaison with the media is so important. Does our department have a formal PIO, or is that a side duty from a regular officer or somebody else? In the aftermath of alleged hate crimes, ensure that comments from the department to the media or general public do not prematurely rule out improper bias motivation. One of the things we saw from the New Year's Day attack in New Orleans was a high-ranking FBI official at a press conference said this was not an act of terror. And very quickly, the evidence and the investigation revealed that it was, in fact, an act of terror. That was an embarrassing moment for that FBI official, and it led to confusion and misinformation going out. We should be ready to conduct public meetings or forums, as needed. And again, working with our liaisons from community-based organizations, they are a voice to their members. And if we can get accurate information out to them, they can repeat it to their groups. And then expand where it's appropriate. The preventive programs that take on hate, improper bias, and crime reduction seminars for school children. How do we partner with the community is going to be significant. And partnering with local organizations, religious leaders, and advocacy groups to enhance hate crime response is important. Again, by working with these groups, we may increase reporting. Holding public forums and the participation in cultural events can build trust within our community. It's interesting, earlier this year, we held an event called Yavapalooza on my campus here at Yavapai College. And this was an open community event of fun activities with bounce houses for the children, with games and booths and food trucks. But it was all built around community engagement. And we had our police officers, our campus police officers were present in uniform, but they were participating in the events themselves. And so they were there as symbols of safety, but they were also there to enjoy the cultural aspects of what Yavapalooza brought to the table. Now, coming soon in the state of Massachusetts is an app called TrustNet 360. TrustNet 360 is going to be a smartphone app that'll be distributed throughout the state. It is developed by researchers at UMass in connection with this training. It's meant to be downloaded by community members and then used by community members. It's trauma-informed, AI-powered platform for targeted violence response. The app will be used to generate community-based reporting, allowing for pattern analysis and then support coordination. Why does it matter to law enforcement? It bridges the underreporting by allowing anonymous tools. It is survivor-consented data to be shared with the police. It builds community trust and healing. It supports early warning and local response teams. And it aligns with the peace officer values of empathy, justice, dignity, and non-carceral solutions. It's integrated with policing goals. to boost collaboration and procedural justice. It is real-time geospatial mapping of hate incidents, and it enables victim-centered and trauma-informed policing. How law enforcement will benefit? It gives us access to anonymized, consent-based community data. It coordinates with non-governmental organizations, with schools, and with responders. And allows us to have access to community source tips, which provides for early alerts. The next steps we'll see in TrustNet 360, and those of you on today's call will have access to information as this moves forward, but there will be a pilot deployment and onboarding of communities. And the goal is to build safer, connected communities working together to prevent hate incident and hate crimes. Now, as we begin to look at the prevention efforts to prevent future targeted violence crimes, obviously TrustNet 360 and that app will be key. We believe that that will help us create early intervention through monitoring of extremist activity. The increase of public awareness about the goals of the police and community leaders, and as the public becomes more aware, we may see more information tips coming in that allows us to intervene before a hate crime can occur. Creating the multidisciplinary planning process to develop a coordinated approach to hate incident and hate crime. And then looking at what are the various commissions and formal groups that address human rights activities, and what other forums exist to promote community harmony and stability, and then working with them. And if they don't exist, how do we create them? And then the focus of public attention on issues around prejudice, intolerance, and the ways that hate crimes affects community vitality and safety. Education initiatives in schools and community centers, raising awareness of the goals and activities of organized hate groups so that people see them for what they are. Developing national, regional, or even state task force to understand and then counter the influence that organized hate groups have. We talked about already how people actually become radicalized on social media. How do we counter that? How do we intervene in the influence that these organized hate groups may have? And then we recognize that children are not born to hate. They're taught to hate. So how can we educate children and young adults to counter the influence that hate groups may have? There's a movie out called 42, and it's the story of Jackie Robinson and being the first African-American to play in the Major League Baseball. And there's a scene in that movie where Jackie Robinson is on the ball field in the state of Florida, and an adult male Caucasian begins to yell at Jackie Robinson down on the field, discriminatory, prejudiced statements. There's a young child standing next to this adult male, and he's probably 8 to 10 years old, and he's looking up at the adult male who is yelling these horrible things at Jackie Robinson. And then pretty soon the young child looks out onto the field at Jackie Robinson, and he begins to yell the same exact discriminatory, prejudiced remarks. We understand that children learn hate from adults and others of influence in their life. So we have to figure out, can we involve parents in efforts to prevent and intervene against bias-motivated behavior when that is evident in their own children? Foster a zero tolerance atmosphere within our schools and colleges. This is significant. We've seen hate incidents, hate crimes occurring at our universities and at our colleges, and we have to promote that zero tolerance climate on our atmosphere where people are held accountable for those actions. Providing students and teachers with opportunities to participate in hate crime prevention courses and activities. Incorporating hate crime education into existing curricula. How do we manage to do that? And I know right here on my campus, there's a whole committee that approves different curricula. but that doesn't mean we should shy away from it. Let's look for ways to incorporate identifying that into our education systems. Reinforcing diversity training and multicultural education at the earliest ages possible. And then how do we provide conflict resolution training to all children? This may help them to, if they're being bullied or if they're being picked on because of, who they are as a child. What strategies can we assist those children with to deal with that? And then intervene when students express discriminatory beliefs before that behavior can escalate. Education of community groups and community leaders about strategies they can employ. Informing vulnerable groups and individuals about ways to protect themselves from bias-motivated incidents and crime. Crime prevention responsibility is bigger than just the police officers that serve there. All of us have a responsibility when it comes to crime prevention. Provide knowledge and impact skills to recognize and defuse high-risk situations. Encourage the strategic planning, collaborative problem solving that we in policing can engage in with community groups. How do we work with local communities on ongoing problem solving? That's one of the components of community policing that was established in the late 70s and 80s. Problem solving, identifying solutions in partnership with the local community, and then encourage responsible and accurate media coverage, partnering with the media so that they report factual information and not sensational alone. Improving the accuracy and completeness of information about these incidents and our response to hate crime. We want to get it right. And so some action items for law enforcement can be the proactive outreach to marginalized communities. And when I say marginalized, these are communities that feel like they've been treated as insignificant. And that may be just a perception. But as we've said before, their perception is their reality. So we have to be sensitive to the fact that marginalized communities may feel they've been treated as insignificant. What are the public statements from the police chief, the sheriff, and other leaders that condemns hate crimes and hate incidents? And then how do we pursue and make priority our partnerships within the community and viewing community leaders, informal and formal, as valuable partners in the co-production of public safety in the community? How do we invite community leaders to serve on the various advisory boards that are formalized within a community? And this is just not for law enforcement, but it could be other advisory boards that a community has set up. And then including those various community leaders, religious leaders in particular. And why do I say that? Because when you think about the number of churches and religious institutions that exist within a community, you'll see that they exist in every neighborhood, possibly within our community. And so those religious leaders that represent their followers are significant, and we want to hear their voices and their concerns. Prioritize participation in community functions and events. We should be there. We should be there ready to be a symbol of safety, but to enjoy and to help us to understand the various aspects of a cultural event or a function. And then developing those formal principles that engage the community. How do we formalize that? We talked about the peace officer framework. When we think about the peace officer mindset in targeted violence investigations, those goals in that mindset are to strengthen community trust, to enhance procedural justice, to protect individuals, and to foster safety within the community. We want to demonstrate empathy. And I'm not talking about sympathy where we feel sorry for people. I'm talking about a dedicated effort to try to connect with the impact, to understand the impact that victims of hate incidents and hate crimes have had. How has that impacted them? We want to understand what they're going through. We want to conduct thorough, bias-free investigations where our own bias is not influencing the investigation in any way. And as I mentioned, the responding officers may be a part of and represent the characteristics of the group that has been targeted. They have to control that. We have to control our bias. And then strengthening relationships with the local stakeholders. Having that proactive, positive relationship with the leaders in the community where communication can be open and trust can be built through that communication. Now, when we talk about procedural justice, we have to keep in mind there's some pillars involved here, and one of them involves the fair treatment of all people, where people have a voice. And we talked earlier about allowing people to vent. That may be useful. Hearing from people about their concerns, letting them talk, letting them have a voice is part of procedural justice. Being transparent as much as possible, getting information out about what we've uncovered in the investigation is key to that transparency. Now, obviously, we talked about this before. There may be legal restraints on certain pieces of information that we can't or don't want to release at that time. Information that may be known only to the suspect has to be withheld because that will help us further identify and make concrete that identification of, in fact, who the suspect is in these crimes. And then, are our motives trustworthy? Are we doing the right thing for the right reasons, for the co-production of community public safety? And are we doing the right things on behalf of the victims of these crimes and these incidents? Now, that's been a lot of information provided to you, and I recognize that at the end of this, you'll have an opportunity to download and review this. But based on what we've talked about so far, let's go through several different role-playing exercises where you're putting yourself in place of the responding officers. And this first one involves a high school. So you're going to be asked to consider yourself as the school resource officer on duty. This scenario addresses racial bias, possibly. So at a local high school in a large city, a 15-year-old Mexican-American male student is sitting in the cafeteria eating lunch when a group of other male students come up behind him and begin to call him names. The name calling includes, "Hey, Beaner," and statements such as, "You enjoying your tacos and beans?" As the group of students start to walk away, one of them slaps the Mexican-American student in the back of the head. You are the school resource officer on duty, and what just occurred is reported to you by another student nearby who witnesses it. So my question to you on today's call is, how would you classify this? And then what are some actions you see can be taken? I'm going to give you about a minute to respond, and feel free to put your responses in the chat box or unmute and state your responses audibly. And again, I'll give you about a full minute to respond. Thank you. Thank you for that response in the chat box. And absolutely, I think you're correct. We have a hate crime here, an assault, an act of violence that occurred. And the reason we're calling it a hate crime is because of the activities that occurred around the assault. The individual that assaulted this Mexican-American student was with the group and participated in the name calling that was based on the national origin of this victim male student. Um, Now, it is of interest that the victim themselves did not report this. And so, while the actions about speaking with the victim to see if they want to be involved as well as the witness, I think that's a legitimate action. You know, we can approach this victim. We also have some actions we can take with the school because the other students that were doing the name calling were clearly bullying this student based on his race. And so the code of conduct within that high school could be very important to us and allow the school to take action against the other male students that were involved when our actions from a law enforcement perspective are going to focus on the student that committed the assault. One of the reasons the victim student may not have reported is for fear of possible retaliation. They are compelled to go to school. And so they may feel like they're going to be coming back to school day after day with this other group that has been harassing him. And so they may have a fear that this may not be over. This may not be a one-off. So working with the school to deal with the other male students is going to be important. And then holding the student that committed the assault accountable for the crime is also going to be important. So thank you for the responses in the chat box. Now, the second scenario involves religious bias. We found that yeah, real quickly, I want to go back to a comment from the chat box, and that's an excellent point. Reaching out to the juveniles' parents that are from these students could be a significant intervention there. Getting the parents to understand what their children are saying and behaving, and getting their support in an intervention could be significant. They need to be made aware that their high school students are participating in these kind of activities. And especially if the school chooses to suspend or expel, then these children are coming home and they're going to be disciplined in that way. So thank you for that additional response. So again, this next one is the Sunday morning worshipers at a Jewish temple were surprised and upset after arriving and finding swastikas spray painted all over the front of the building, spray paint cans left nearby. But then upon entering the building, additional vandalism was found and a handwritten note calling for all Jews to die. The rabbi has reported this to the police. So in this case here, I'm asking you on today's training, how would you classify this? And what are some actions you see being able to be taken? You are the responding police. I'll give you about 1 minute to respond to this scenario. Yeah, and thank you for that response in the chat box. And I would absolutely agree with you that this is clearly a hate crime. This temple was targeted because of their association with the characteristics of um, the Jewish people. And yeah, what steps can be taken to identify a suspect? Obviously, we want to collect the spray paint cans. We want to do a comprehensive crime scene investigation, um, photographing the swastikas that are spray painted, collecting those cans. Collecting the note is going to be important because we can use techniques like ninhydrin spray to develop fingerprints on paper. And so not only is the significance of what the note said important to the investigation, clearly a threat, wanting to do harm to people that are Jews, but how that evidence can help us identify a um, a possible suspect. And as you mentioned in the chat box there, has there been something that has occurred recently that would bring to mind the rabbi identifying possible individuals? Why is this happening now? Is it related to a significant event where it could be more randomly that they've been targeted? Or did something happen recently where um, the um, the identity of somebody may come to mind? So some other actions we can take to maybe help reassure the Jewish community, parking the police vehicles in their parking lot when their services are continuing. Um, have there been hate incidents in the community that went unreported that now we can go back and pull into the investigation? Is this an increase in frequency and severity of what has been going on? And is there any chatter on social media that would help us to identify or possibly add to the investigation? So all of these are going to be important, and it would be important that a comprehensive investigation that could help us lead to a suspect would be important. This action here is going to create fear and concern with the entire Jewish community. So thank you for the investigation or the information you've provided in the chat box. And then this third scenario is a sexual orientation bias scenario. And what we have here is a 19-year-old openly gay male reports to the police that he's been identified in a social media post and derogatory language was used in connection with the post. He reports that in the post, he was referred to as a faggot. The social media also includes statements against him that he was going to burn in hell for the sexual sin of homosexuality. This individual wants to file a hate crime charge against the person who posted the information on social media. So our question for you on today's training is, how would you classify this? And then what actions could we take in this situation here? And I'll give you about a minute to. This scenario is a little more challenging for us because I think one of the concerns we have here is we're up against First Amendment protected speech. However disturbing and unpleasant and hateful that speech is. Um, the individual wants to file a hate crime charge. And in this case here, we have, he's being targeted and stating he's going to burn in hell for the sexual sin of homosexuality. So this could be considered um, a protected speech because of a religious belief that the poster has. And I think you're exactly right. Your post in the chat box identifies this as a hate incident. We should certainly document it and then what was the involvement, as you put in the chat box? What was this? Why was he targeted specifically by this individual? Um, we could also identify the platform that he's using and see if there's a code of conduct violation that the platform would use then to take these posts down. One of the concerns is because it's posted in social media, could that influence others to begin to target this individual and other members who identify as homosexual or gay? So there's some things that we can do, and there is some follow-up that can occur, but just what we have on the face here is may not be enough to classify this as a hate crime. We also can identify the poster and talk to them. Why did they post this? What is their thinking? There's nothing wrong with us approaching them and talking to them about their post, and even though it may not represent criminal activity. Thank you for participating in these here. And thinking about what worked well in these scenarios and what challenges were encountered, we clearly had some information that the crime investigation would help us to identify the elements of the crime. And so that worked well. We were able to identify the elements of a crime. And then we were also able to identify the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident. Some of the challenges that we encountered was in the school incident, the victim himself may not want to work with the police. The victim himself didn't report. And so we're working through a witness. And then also, that one of the challenges is going to be working with the school for the school to step up and enforce their own code of conduct policy. In the religious bias incident, we've got to identify a suspect. And identifying a suspect can be challenging. We need tips to come in from the community. We need to work and see if there's fingerprints within a database. We need to connect this to maybe other hate incidents that went unreported, and then work with the rabbi to see if we can identify what happened with an individual that prompted this temple to be targeted. And then finally, in the third incident, we're working with First Amendment protected speech, however unpleasant and however inappropriate and hate-filled it might be. So that's a challenge in and of itself, but we can work with the social media platform to enforce their code of conduct. And then we can begin to work with that suspect, work with the person that posted that hateful stuff and find out what is their motivation. What are they hoping to accomplish? And do they understand that their post could influence others to take it to the next level and create hate crimes? And do they have civil responsibility in that could lead them to be held accountable civilly? So there are things that worked well and there are challenges we encountered, but thank you for participating in that. Now we're coming to the close of this training today, and want to ask you to take the post-test. You took the pre-test, and what we want to do is compare the pre-test and the post-test to see if there were changes and ways we can improve the training. So on this next slide is the QR code, and then also in the chat box, you'll see here in a moment, you'll see the link to the post test. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to take this. The survey link is in the chat box and the QR code is here. So let's come back in 3 minutes following your taking of the post test eval. Thank you for taking the post-training eval. Now, also in the chat box is a link to all the materials that you can use to download from today's training. Always interested in feedback. Thank you for participating in the scenarios. One of the calls to action that we want from today's training is to apply the peace officer framework, where the emphasis is on empathy, engagement, and accountability. And so in thinking about the peace officer framework, we look at the principles of effective policing. We must do what it's supposed to do to keep a community safe. Empathetic policing, where the peace officer emphasizes empathy by understanding as best as we can others' feelings. Peace policing can become more effective and just. And what is just policing? It's policing that is constitutionally correct. It ensures fairness and equal treatment. And then the concept of doing no harm. Policing agencies must anticipate that there are unintended, possible harmful consequences of our otherwise well-meaning actions. We must promote a cultural shift towards the mentality of police officers as peace officers. Right there in your state of Massachusetts, your Massachusetts post certifies you as peace officers, just like we do here in Arizona. And it encourages our officers to view our role as guardians of the community with a law enforcement duty. Rightful policing is policing that is rooted and characterized by unbiased enforcement and community engagement and ethical conduct. It is effective, empathetic, and just, and it inspires officers with the nobility of policing. Now, we do have a formal peace officer project training that's available online at police2peace.org. And it's interesting, we will be in Swampscott, Massachusetts on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd to conduct in-person training on the Peace Officer Project for that community. And I understand from the chief there is he is opening that up to other agencies as well. The expected outcomes of today's training was to enhance investigative skills, improve relationships with communities, the prevention of hate crimes and hate incidents, the potential to address this at its earliest possible point, the successful prosecution of offenders, and resource identification. And here's a list of some of the resources that were used in the creation of today's training. And again, these handouts should be available to you. Here's the QR code for today's handouts. And again, the link to these is in the chat box as well. As we come to the close of today's training, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to attend today's training. And hopefully this was useful information to you. And thank you for participating in the scenarios too. That was most appreciated. Have a great rest of your day. And I look forward to being in Massachusetts here very, very soon.